Thank you very much. Not only is vaping a topic of interest to me and one I like talking about, but I especially like talking about it in the city of Paris. Love this city. So thank you for inviting me. Let's see. Okay, no conflicts of interest unless you consider government funding a conflict of interest. I do have quite a few grants, including I'm the principal investigator of a center that's focused on modeling e-cigarettes and their interrelationship with cigarettes. I was asked to focus, and I'll focus primarily on youth. It's probably good that I do that because there's a lot of controversy in the United States right now around youth vaping, and I'll be glad to talk about that later if you'd like, but I'm going to focus mostly on what we've seen so far. And as probably you all know, the United States has had a fairly restrictive view towards e-cigarettes. Now there's lots of discussions of implementing some fairly harsh restrictions, but up until now, we haven't seen that. So it provides a good example of what could happen if vaping is allowed to run its course. We use a public health standard, and I think this is important. This is what the FDA supposedly uses, and I think it's a good standard. It looks at the toxicity of e-cigarettes or vaping relative to smoking. It looks at the effects on cessation, and it looks at the effects on initiation of all nicotine products. First, I'll present some results that are for the entire population. They're meant to be hypothetical results. I'm not trying to predict anything here. My goal in writing this paper, and it's gotten plenty of attention, believe me, is to show what kind of potential effects there could be with e-cigarettes. So we project forward and we look at the health effects. And what we try to do is look at it under two scenarios so that people could see, you could have different views, but how do the outcomes differ? First is what we call the optimistic scenario. Frankly, that's the one I think is probably most realistic, and that's one where e-cigarettes have 5% the risk of cigarettes, based on the only published estimate there is out of Public Health England. Well, actually, there's another one very similar, but that's one that seems to have been supported by the data. We also make very I call reasonable assumptions here about cessation and initiation. Some might even view these as conservative. It turns out they are conservative based on some of the data I'm going to show you. Then we took a pessimistic approach. And basically what I did here is I went to somebody who I considered, still somebody who's reliable, but is very concerned about e-cigarettes, and asked him, what's the worst possible risk you can see e-cigarettes having? And this is even with it unregulated. With regulation, you could keep the risks even more manageable. This is even without regulation, and he told me 40%. We also assumed that people would be less likely to quit cigarettes, they'd be unlikely to quit vaping once they started, and that initiation would go up quite substantially. So we ran the numbers. We used modeling. I've been doing modeling for a long time, and I used a very standard model with standard data. And basically, what we find in the optimistic case, there's about almost 7 fewer deaths, 7 million fewer deaths if e-cigarettes are allowed to become a good substitute for smoking, and 87 million life years saved. And that's taking into account that people who smoke tend to die between 10 and 20 years earlier than if they had not smoked. So this is according a much lower risk if they had instead used e-cigarettes. Even under the pessimistic scenario, there's still big gains. 1.6 million lives are saved, and that's of the population in 2016, and almost 20 million life years saved. That's big. Believe me, those are big numbers, even for the United States. Okay, so, we do see gains. And this is, again, mostly, whatever you think about e-cigarettes, at least be open to the possibility that they can have good effects. Well, now, and that's for the overall population. Most of those effects are through increased cessation, which has been supported by the data. I'm going to focus today on youth. And there's a couple of messages that I want to get across. First of all, and most importantly, it's not just vaping. Even no matter what your views on vaping, it's not the person who goes to a party on the weekends and vapes a couple times. That's only a concern if they become a regular vapor. And, that's not to say that it's as bad as smoking, but, that's when it becomes a health concern. People that quit smoking before the age of 30 have very little risks. So for sure, we would expect the same or even better with vaping if people quit early. So it's established youth. And also, the other important thing is what the individual would have done in the absence of e-cigarettes. And I drew this diagram. I know to many of you, all these boxes, what's going on here? But I want to point out one or two important things here. First of all, the important distinction is what that individual would have done if they hadn't vaped, okay? This first group up here is people who would have smoked, okay? Instead, they tried e-cigarettes. They might have tried and quit, okay? And it might mean that they not only quit vaping, but they didn't smoke at all instead. That's clearly a gain. Nobody would doubt that that's a gain. They may have continued vaping and moved on to smoking. As a dual user, harder to gauge how much their risks would be reduced. Probably some gains there also. But clearly, if they were also continued to vape, they tried vaping, they liked it, and they continue to vape. And remember, these are people that would have smoked. There are gains. That's why I put this in green. Go. On the other hand, the concern, and it is a legitimate concern, is the people who would not have smoked. And there is the possibility that those people who wouldn't have smoked or presumably use any kind of nicotine product continue on and become a vapor. There's some risk there, much lower. Might become a dual user or a smoker. That's the concern. That's what people refer to as the gateway effect, and that's the biggest concern really that you would have with e-cigarettes. Okay, so we did a model. I won't even go through the results, but it indicated, again, using what we tried to come up with, conservative parameters and so on. And again, we found that with e-cigarettes, there were likely to be substantial gains. Here we did a cohort analysis. We followed people, beginning at younger ages through their life and compared the likelihood of dying at certain ages, relative to if they hadn't used any product at all. Again, big gains. Okay, so then the question becomes, that's a model, okay? A model is a model, To me, a model is close to reality. To most people, it's just a model. So you got to look at the data. And what I did is I looked at the data. I did a paper called a reality check. And I'm going to kind of move quickly. And I did it primarily because there was a report that was, in general, was very good. It was put out by the National Academy of Sciences, and it did support the view that e-cigarettes have much, much lower risk than cigarettes. It supported the view that e-cigarettes have helped people quit smoking. But when it came to youth, it suggested that e-cigarettes are leading to more youth smoking, okay? And this is a big concern. This is where much of the focus is. You know, much of the focus is on youth. You know, when the reality is we have all these people that are out there smoking and are going to die of smoking. So this got a lot of attention. So I looked at it, and this is where I did a paper which I call a reality check, to look at the actual data. What's happening with smoking since e-cigarettes started becoming popular? And, you know, so first thing we did was we looked at when did youth start smoking e-cigarettes, and it seemed to take off somewhere around 2013, 2014. This study was only up through 2017. I'll provide some extension of those results, though. You know, so what we did is we looked at smoking rates, and we did trend lines to look at smoking rates before 2013, and then how those trends changed since then, as an indication of the potential effects of vaping. Again, skip go. So again, the key is to look at trends before, look at trends after, but also an important consideration here is to look at different measures of use. You know, so often what you hear is last 30-day use. And again, a lot of those people could be very socially well-adjusted people. They went to a party, they vaped. They might do it again. They might even do it 3 or 4 times. Is that a concern? No. It's if they're much more established use. So we tried to distinguish, and we looked at 5 different data sets. We looked at different age groups, and we did that, and we compared across the different studies. And we did a time trend analysis. We looked at lots of different ways of estimating the time trends and so on. And we came up with very, very consistent results. These are the results. Again, a lot of numbers. The important thing to point out here is we have this long-term vaping. This is the trend downward in smoking. There's been a trend downward in smoking. This is one of the reasons why people are concerned about vaping. They're concerned that it could reverse that. But then we looked at what happened afterwards, and what we found, and it's very consistent for all these different data sets, for all these different age groups, that the rate of downward decline in smoking doubled, tripled, or even quadrupled. You know, and best if you see that. You know, and in the data I'm going to show you even goes beyond that, because, you know, a lot of the real concern is since 2017, because that's when Juul came on the scene. You know, and Juul is a strong vaping product. And so there was concern of the addictiveness and the potential effects on smoking and that kind of thing, especially with youth. Okay. So this is the trend. This is for 12th graders. So these are people about 17 or 18 years old. This is last 30-day use. Again, not the best measure. Not the best measure. But what do we see? There's this downward trend. This is smoking rates. You know, it was up at about 25% in 2002, down to about 16, 17%. If it kept going, it would have probably declined more. But look what actually happened. You know, this is the reality check. It went down by almost 35% more than it would have in the absence of e-cigarettes. That's pretty amazing stuff, even if you're not a modeler like me. So again, now look at a more established measure, daily use of cigarettes. Okay, you know, clearly that's a major concern. We have the long-term trend. And again, the results actually indicate less daily use of cigarettes. Okay, this is some data. It was actually put together from some people in England using our data. It's okay. And what it shows is that, you know, again, it shows vaping went up about 2013 or 14. Here's really what to focus on, cigarette smoking. You know, it went down. It continued to go down. And this probably gives the least, I don't know, the data that indicates the least benefits from vaping, but still you see smoking going down. And next, I want to show you what I consider the most important data. Or, actually, before I do that, let me make a point, and that is the point. You know, I keep saying to you, it's not just that people vaped in the last 30 days. It's that they're vaping more regularly. And so, again, I took this data from some work that Robert West and others in England did. And what it gives you is the percentage of people using this NYTS data set, which is a fairly large data set. And it indicates about close to 12% had any last 30-day use in the US. But of those, only about 2% were using more than 20 days. That's a good measure of regular use. So that's about 20%. Okay, so this number you hear, last 30 days, is not people who necessarily are serious in any sense of the word vapors. Many of them weekend vapors. Many of them less than 5 days, as it turns out. Okay, so now we get to my favorite figure. And it is my favorite because it's 18 to 24-year-olds, okay? And I would argue that's when you see the more established patterns. You know, we know what high school kids are like. You know, anybody that's been in a house with a teenager, you know, maybe, you know, their actions are sometimes erratic. 18 to 24, still a bit erratic, but things have calmed down a little, and more established patterns have been set. So again, we did the trend line analysis, and we drew our trend line out. And it's very interesting. In 2013, we had smoking rates, and these are people that smoked at least 100 cigarettes. So again, it's a little better measure of established use. It had gone down. By 2014, it was about a little over 16%. By 2018, so this is after Juul had come onto the scene and was, you know, used by many youth, we see that the smoking rate was at 7 and 8%, 7.8%, excuse me. That's more than a 50% reduction. And let me tell you something, I've done modeling for over 40 countries. I have never seen anything like that in terms of reduction in smoking in such a short period of time for such a key group. You know, so to me, this is very important. Now, is this the end of the story? No, we got to keep watching things. But these indicate some very important and beneficial trends from a public health perspective. So just to conclude, it appears so far that the public health impact of vaping is positive. We got to still look at things, but so far the indications are pretty good that we're making major dents in smoking, and in particular, we're reducing smoking among youth. So contrary to the NASM report, the National Academy of Sciences report, which was done, you know, what's very important when you look at any study is when was it done? Many of these studies were done in 2012 and 13. That's a whole different kind of e-cigarettes than we have now. But the data, you know, still, regardless, we look at it, there is not, or at least no kind of detectable gateway effect. Could it be explained by other factors? Possibly, but unlikely. We haven't seen any strong cigarette policies implemented that could explain the drastic reductions that we've seen in smoking among youth and young adults. So we need to keep looking. You know, Juul is a concern. We need to watch it, and the future will tell us more. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, professeur Levy, pour